Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am Annika, your host, and today I want to talk about something that I personally have been experiencing. Something that I think a lot of long-term practitioners also might be feeling or have felt before. And it's definitely something that I think we don't really discuss openly enough about or really get into. So I think I'm going to call it the witch's plateau. I know that's a little cheesy, but it's really that point in your magical practice where you've been practicing for years, maybe even a decade or more, and suddenly you realize you're not doing as many spells as you used to. Your altar might be gathering a bit of dust. Maybe you're still celebrating the Sabbats, but they've become more routine than revelatory. You still identify deeply as a witch, right? But when was the last time you actually cast a circle or performed formal working? And here's the thing, it's not because you don't believe anymore, it's not because you don't care. It's something more subtle and honestly a little bit more interesting. I have hit this point a few times within my practice, to be honest, where there's just quiet, right? Things quiet down, like the ebbs and flows that we talk about pretty often. But it's not that I ever felt less powerful. It's almost like I could picture that inner witch fire deep inside, just glowing. The fire was not dead. The coals are still hot and ready to be ignited. But it came to a point where I was not actively feeding the fire to keep it large. I really just looked around at my life and realized that many of the things I'd originally come to magic for, like stability, self empowerment, healing from religious trauma, finding my voice, even just that initial connection I felt as a child to the spirits in the other world, I'd actually kind of achieved. And the desperate energy that fueled my early practice, at least, had really transformed into something calmer. And with that calm came a strange new challenge. What does your practice become when you're no longer performing magic out of necessity or out of crisis? So, today's episode is for all of you who maybe experienced witches who might be feeling a little bit stuck, a little stagnant, or simply in a different phase of your relationship with magic. We're going to explore what happens when we reach this sort of plateau, how to distinguish between evolution and stagnation, what magic looks like beyond basic manifestation, and practical ways to deepen rather than just expand your practice. By all means, this isn't a Witchcraft 101. I am not going to be really covering any basics. It's more like a Witchcraft 401, advancing your practice when really the basics no longer call. So let's start by talking about how to recognize when you've hit this plateau, because it can be subtle. Unlike a crisis of faith, which tends to be dramatic and obvious, right? The witch's plateau often creeps in quietly. For me, at least, I noticed it first in my relationship with my tools. For example, I still had them all. I still cared for them, but I wasn't using them with the same frequency or urgency. My candles were more decorative than working tools. My herbs were perfectly organized and largely untouched. You might also notice in your relationship with the magical calendar, the Sabbats become obligations rather than celebrations. The full moon rises and sets, and you realize you've done nothing to mark it. The natural rhythm that once guided your practice starts to feel more like background noise. Another sign is what I call magical window shopping. This is kind of addictive when you find yourself collecting books, tools, or supplies without actually incorporating them into your practice. Your Pinterest or your Instagram is full of these ritual ideas you never implement. You follow witch influencers and feel a pang of something, not quite envy, not quite nostalgia, when you see their enthusiastic practice. If any of this really sounds familiar, you're probably experienced enough to recognize that what you're feeling isn't laziness or failure, it's just natural evolution. The plateau happens precisely because you've grown, right? Because magic has done its work in your life. The frantic energy of beginning practice, when every spell feels urgent and necessary, has given way to something more subtle. And here's where we can distinguish between evolution and stagnation. I think stagnation comes with negative emotions personally, things like boredom, disillusionment, a sense of emptiness. Whereas evolution Even when it includes periods of reduced activity, carries a sense of integration. Your magic hasn't disappeared. It's become so woven into your life that it no longer stands apart from your everyday existence. I began to realize that my feelings of almost guilt were not guilt at all, but it's not because I've fallen away from magic. Maybe it's because I've fallen so deeply into it that I no longer need to follow these formal structures that I once did. That conversation with myself was the beginning of my understanding that the plateau isn't a problem to solve. It's more like a threshold to cross. It's an invitation to evolve how we think about magical practice itself. When many of us first come to witchcraft, we're driven by specific needs or desires. Maybe we need protection from a toxic situation. Maybe we want to attract love or abundance. Maybe we're seeking healing from trauma or even empowerment in a world that's made us feel powerless. Witchcraft is often birthed into someone's life when they need a release of tension in one way or another. Obviously, I also believe that most of us are just called or meant to be on this sort of path too, but really it all starts from somewhere. These are valid and important reasons to begin a magical practice by all means. Magic helps us survive difficult times and transform painful circumstances. But what happens when those acute needs are addressed? What happens when your life actually starts to stabilize and you are on this steady path with no more twists in the road? When you've built the confidence and boundaries that your early magical practice helped you develop? This is when the purpose of magic itself begins to transform. And I think this evolution follows a pattern for many practitioners, one that mirrors spiritual development in many traditions. In the beginning, magic is very transactional. We perform specific actions expecting specific results. We cast a spell for a job and we get the job. We do protection working and we suddenly feel safer. Maybe even see the results of those wards and the protections actively working. This cause and effect relationship is satisfying and it's very reinforcing. It gives us concrete feedback that our magic works. But as we advance, magic often becomes more relational than transactional. Instead of just performing actions to get results, we begin developing relationships with deities, if that's part of your practice, with ancestors, with the elements, with the land itself. The focus shifts from what these forces can do for us to how we can be in the right relationship with them. And then, for many experienced practitioners, magic evolves one step further from relational to expressional. At this stage, I really think magical practice becomes less about what we get or even who we connect with, and more about expressing our authentic magical nature. Magic becomes less something we do and more something we are. My own journey really followed this path. I was always into, quote, magic, but when I really first started practicing was when, my parents really started to fight in the household. My environment started to really crumble. I fell into, my own depression for other reasons also at a very young adolescence, and I had a very hard time attending school regularly because of this. Not that my grades were bad, they were actually pretty good, but I really started to focus on my art, my poetry, my writing, and my magic. It was very goal oriented at first. I needed a release to reclaim my personal power, to create boundaries, and then I realized I needed to heal trauma. I did specific workings for specific outcomes, and they did help me tremendously. So as I developed, my practice became more focused on building relationships with spirits, with the land where I lived, with specific energies or forces I felt called to work with. The magic became more collaborative than commanding, if that makes sense. And now I find myself in this new phase where magic has become more expressional. It's less about achieving particular outcomes and more about living authentically as a magical being. The formal spell work has decreased, not because magic matters less, but because it has become so integrated into my way of being that it expresses itself more continuously and subtly than before. I'm closer to my spirits now. I have deeper and more personal relationships. I have experimented with performing spells and rituals within the other world and my own inner temple. And now I am back on a cute little bender with learning again, learning new things and discovering new artists, new authors, other witches. A new phase is coming in where, I find myself picking up and reading a few more books. I am even looking into signing up for courses from, again, other amazing practitioners who have their own platforms. This evolution isn't linear or universal. We all have unique paths, and we all still do outcome-based magic sometimes because, well, life still brings challenges that require specific magical responses. And like I said, with an increased and stronger relationship with your spirits, there might be contracts and there might be regular offerings and things like that to really uphold the inner household of your spirits. But recognizing this broader pattern of evolution can help us understand why our relationship with spellcraft might be changing and how to flow with that change rather than to fight it. I think one of the most beautiful evolutions in magical practice is the shift from magic as manipulation to magic as communion. As we mature in our practice, many of us find ourselves being drawn to magic that simply communes with what is. Rituals that don't ask for anything specific, but instead honor the moment, express gratitude, or witness the turning of natural cycles. There's a profound peace in this kind of magic, resting in reality rather than struggling against it. I've really found myself practicing what I guess I can call kind of like an observational magic, rituals where I simply just observe and connect with natural phenomena without trying to direct or change them. Maybe it's watching a thunderstorm with full magical awareness, studying the growth patterns in my garden with my full witch's consciousness engaged. These aren't passive activities by all means, they're active, and it's a magical communion that generate their own kind of power. Another form of magic beyond manifestation is what we might call devotional practice. This doesn't necessarily mean devotion to deities, though it can if that is part of your practice. It can also mean devotion to principles, to the land itself, to your ancestors, to your spirit court, or to the highest understanding of what is true and beautiful to you. Devotional practices often focus on regular offerings, like I said, expressions of gratitude or acts of service without expectation of direct return. We're kind of doing it in the name of magic. When I first started incorporating devotional elements into my practice, I'm not gonna lie, it kind of felt strange, almost like I wasn't, quote, doing magic anymore because I wasn't trying to achieve any specific results. But over time, I've come to recognize that these practices generate a different kind of magic, one that transforms me rather than my circumstances, that opens channels for wisdom and connection rather than this material manifestation. I think one of the absolute keys to keeping your magic alive during these sort of plateau phases is the spirit work. And I know not everyone is into that, but it is definitely something that is huge in my practice. It's always been something I've been so connected to as I was young. So developing and maintaining relationships with land spirits, with house spirits, wandering spirits, and other entities that share our reality, your plant allies, your animal allies, even if you create servitors and tulpas and egregores and all that stuff, right? This kind of relational practice serves multiple purposes. First, it keeps your magical senses sharp and attuned even when you're not actively casting spells. So, really, when you regularly commune with spirits, you're exercising those subtle perceptions and maintaining that openness to the unseen. But beyond that, spirit work creates a web of reciprocal relationships that sustains your practice through changing seasons of need. Think of it this way: if the only time you interact with spirits is when you need something, that's not a relationship. That's just magical convenience. But when you regularly acknowledge the spirit of your home, you leave offerings for the land where you live, or maintain connections with specific entities or ancestors that have crossed your path, you're building genuine magical alliances. I've found that during periods when I wasn't doing much formal spell work, maintaining these relationships really kept my practice vital and meaningful. And there's a practical benefit too. When circumstances do arise that call for specific magical intervention, you don't have to start from scratch. You have your allies already, connections already in place, spiritual relationships that have been nurtured through consistent attention. Your magic becomes more effective, not because your techniques have necessarily improved, but because you're just not working alone anymore. This shift from seeing spirits as tools or forces to be directed towards seeing them as allies and companions on your path marks a profound evolution in a magic practice. It transforms magic from something you do occasionally to something you live continuously, even during those plateau phases when formal spellcraft might be less frequent. Divination practice is another powerful way to keep your witch's fire stoked, especially during these periods. I've found that even maintaining a regular divination, whether that's daily card pulling, weekly tarot spreads, or monthly scrying sessions, this really keeps you actively engaged with magical energies, even when you're not casting spells. There's something about this regular communion with symbols and this intuitive wisdom that is within you that maintains an open channel between worlds. I have picked up a new interest in tasseomancy with coffee grinds, mostly because I am really getting into Armenian coffee right now. So, as a little side note, if anyone has any tips and tricks, I would love to hear it from you. But what's particularly valuable about divination is that it doesn't require the intense, focused energy that spell work often does. Instead, it invites a receptive state, a willingness to listen rather than direct, to receive rather than project. This receptivity is a different magical muscle, right? One that we sometimes neglect when we're focused primarily on manifestation work. By regularly practicing divination, you're maintaining a balanced approach to magical energy, learning to receive guidance as readily as you send intention. I've noticed, at least within my own practice, that the times when I'm most consistent with divination are also the times where my overall magical awareness definitely feels more sharp. Even simple practices like pulling a single card each morning or spending time with a pendulum before making decisions. I don't lean on a pendulum very heavily by all means, but it is something that I have tried to lean into. Creating these kind of touch points, right, throughout ordinary life that keep you connected to your magical self. Um, Also, my bones. I do have an episode on osteomancy, and my bone throwing kit is another huge one that I love to always go back to. But these small moments of stepping between worlds prevent the dust from settling on your magical consciousness, even during periods when elaborate rituals or spells castings are rare. There's also what I think of as a magic for magic's sake. Ritual practices that exist simply for the joy and the beauty of performing them. Just as an experienced dancer might dance alone in their kitchen with no audience, or a singer might sing in the shower with no audience, no goal beyond the pleasure of just moving their body and exercising their vocal cords. An experience which might work magic simply for the joy of engaging with that current power. I have certain rituals that I perform simply because they just bring me joy, and arrangements of natural objects in spiral patterns, singing to the moon while I have a fire going, decorating my goat skeleton. I think I've said this before on the podcast on my episode about goats, but I have this like Halloween decoration. It's like a Black Phillip. Well, it's named Black Phillip, but it's a goat skeleton that makes noise. But I unplugged it, or it's not really plugged in. But I have that in my garden, and I love to decorate the goat with all sort of adornments and flowers and plants and things like sigils, just any really magical materia that fits the season or the Sabbath. Even creating certain moments of connection with my garden plants. These aren't for anything in a transactional sense, they're expressions of my magical nature, and that expression is enough. The shift beyond manifestation doesn't mean we never do goal-oriented magic anymore. Life still brings challenges, and experienced witches still reach for those tools when needed, but our practice expands to include these other dimensions of magic that aren't about getting or changing anything, but simply about being fully present with the magical current that runs through all things. So when we hit this plateau, there are generally two directions that we go in to reignite our practice. We can expand outward or we can deepen inward. Both are valid paths, but they offer very different experiences. Expanding outward means learning new systems, like acquiring new tools, exploring traditions you haven't worked with before. This approach brings the freshness of novelty and can certainly reignite your interest and your enthusiasm. If you've primarily practiced one tradition of witchcraft, exploring another can bring new perspectives and techniques that revitalize your work. But there's another direction we can go in when we hit this plateau, and that's deepening inward. Rather than expanding into new territories, we can dive more deeply into practices that we already know. This often means stripping away the complexity rather than adding it, getting to the essential core of practices that we've perhaps been performing somewhat automatically. Things Think about it like the difference between trying 10 different meditation techniques versus practicing the same meditation daily for a year. Both approaches have value, right? But the depth that comes from sustained, focused practice offers a different kind of wisdom than the breadth that comes from exploration. In my own journey, after a period of expansion, I have felt called toward this deepening approach. I decided to work with just 4 core practices, one aligned with each element, and commit to them regularly. And with complete presence, I set aside the complexity of elaborate rituals and focused on these simple foundational practices. And really, what I discovered in this deepening was that practices I thought I knew well still had layers I hadn't accessed. By doing less, but doing it more mindfully and more consistently and with more presence, I found new depths in familiar territory. It wasn't about learning new techniques, but about bringing more of myself to the techniques I already knew. This deepening approach is countercultural in many ways. We live in a world that values novelty, accumulation, and constant expression. The idea that spiritual growth might come through reduction rather than addition, through focus rather than diversification, runs against many of our cultural assumptions. But it's a pattern that we see in spiritual traditions worldwide. The master who works with just one practice until it reveals its deepest secrets. So, when you hit the plateau, consider which paths call to you more strongly. Do you need the stimulus of new learning, new tools, new traditions, or do you need the challenge of going deeper into what you already know, bringing more presence and commitment to familiar practices? There's really no right answer here. Some of us are naturally expansive learners, while others thrive on depth and mastery. Some phases of life call for expansion, while others just call for the deepening. The key is making a conscious choice rather than remaining stuck on the plateau. For those drawn to expansion, you might explore traditions you've never studied, research historical practices, or learn skills that complement your magical work, like herbalism, astrology, even divination systems you're unfamiliar with. You might attend workshops or conferences, join groups practicing different forms of magic, or study with teachers from traditions outside of your familiar territory. For those drawn to deepening, you might select a handful of core practices and commit to performing them with full awareness over an extended period. You might keep a detailed journal of your experiences with these practices, noting these subtle shifts and insights. You might even revisit foundational texts of your tradition with fresh eyes, looking for nuances that you've missed before. Either way, the key is conscious engagement. The plateau happens not because we've learned everything there is to know about magic, because that's never going to happen, but because we've fallen into patterns that no longer fully engage us. By choosing either to expand our knowledge or deepen our practice, we bring fresh attention, fresh commitment, and fresh presence into our craft. And maybe it's both. So, gosh, I feel like that was a big tangent. But I really want to wrap this up, and I want to emphasize that hitting this plateau in your magical practice isn't a sign of failure or backsliding. It's actually a success sign. It's evidence that magic has done its primary work in your life so thoroughly that you've evolved beyond your initial needs and motivations. This plateau is not a stopping place, but it's kind of like a launching pad. It's an opportunity to reassess what magic means to you now, how it can serve you in your current phase of life, and how you want to engage with it moving forward. It's a chance to really evolve from a witch who does magic to meet specific needs into a witch whose very existence is magical. So, if you are experiencing this kind of lull or this plateau, I honestly would love to hear about your journey. What practices have you incorporated to move beyond it? And have you chosen kind of the path of expansion or the path of deepening? Remember that evolution is not the same as stagnation, and that sometimes the most powerful magic happens not when we're frantically working spells, but when we are fully present with the magical reality that flows through all things, including ourselves. So, beyond all that, I just want to say thank you for listening on this episode. And wherever you are in this world, as always, I hope that you have a wonderful morning, day,